Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today, do security ratings give a false sense of security? A question that comes up frequently, both from a third-party perspective, as security ratings are purported to represent the security posture of an organization, as well as from a consumer or customer side, as we look at our third-party ecosystem. What role do security ratings play in key decisions that we need to make about our risk management strategy and program? And I'm joined today by two esteemed guests. I'm very, very pleased indeed to have with me two experts from the field, practitioners in their own right, representing both sides of that equation that I was just referencing. And I'm going to start by introducing Norah Beers, who is Chief Information Security Officer for Grayscale Investments. Welcome, Norah. Thank you so much for joining us. Norah is responsible for enterprise security risk management and IT infrastructure and support. She came to Grayscale after 12 years at Bridgewater Associates, where she headed investment engineering, which is a fantastic title I've not yet come across in my many years. Before that, she was head of information security for Bridgewater's front office, where she led the protection of the intellectual property and assets of Bridgewater's investment engine. She's an expert in integrated risk management for financial firms and is known for her ability to minimize risk to financial operations while executing complex technology transformations. She holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College. She lives in Connecticut with her family. Norah, thank you again. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks, Peter. Happy to be here.
Our second guest today, Chris Nolan, is the value chain security leader at Cisco. And in this role, Chris leads a specialized team which drives security compliance and risk remediation efforts into Cisco's value security chain, a key ecosystem made up of Cisco's critical suppliers, manufacturers, and strategic partners. In addition, Chris's team manages all incoming third-party risk management requests required by Cisco's global customer base, which is extensive, as we all know. And Cisco leverages CyberGRX both on the supply and customer sides of the house. So who better to have with us today to talk about this really fascinating topic of security ratings, which have garnered a significant place in the risk management universe. And oftentimes, because in absence of other data, what do we have to work with? Well, we'll get into that in a little bit, but I wanted to start by just asking our two guests today to talk a little bit about their experience with security ratings and how those get used in their third-party ecosystem. Norah, I wonder if I could start with you. Tell us a little bit about how you use security ratings today and what role they play in your organization.
Sure. So, when I joined Grayscale, I was suddenly in a very different environment where third-party risk was the majority of the risk the firm held, or at least most of our risks sat with our third parties. That was new for me, primarily before I was in an intellectual property protection mode, where most of our risks sat on our own systems, under our own control. I was also coming into an environment that was fairly early in terms of developing its security programs. We had already a lot of third parties that had been assessed, but in sort of the old school traditional way of through, open-ended DDQ questions, not as much validation except for our most critical third parties. And so I would have quickly needed to get a sense of what was the landscape of our third party risk, what really mattered to us, what did we care about, how could I prioritize some of the areas where I wanted to do a more in-depth assessment and ensure I had the appropriate controls. And then be able to synthesize that risk and be able to report it up accurately to sort of our oversight functions that we've got. And so one of the ways that I did that was sort of using CyberGRX and being able to pop everybody in there, get an initial sense through the data that's just in the system before actually talking to any of my third parties, and then beginning in a very sort of risk-based way, picking out who did I want to go and get more information on and in what order. That led me to be able to, in a more methodical way, really deal with the risk that I had and leave some of the stuff that wasn't as important to later on.
That's a very good, thank you for that outline. And if I follow the flow there, Norah, were you working with security ratings vendors before you encountered CyberGRX and our solution, or was that coincidence in timing, just to help other folks on the call understand that a little bit more?
Sure. But some of the more traditional security ratings vendors. So, some of the players that have been around for 10, 15 years We were using those before. I had not used a service like CyberGRX before, where there was also validation, where it was as thorough and as mapped to all the different frameworks as CyberGRX is, and not an exchange.
That's great. That's helpful. And we'll talk more about, do they coexist? When would you use one? When would you use the other? And how we think about that as we go through, just so that people understand a little bit of the CyberGRX approach to this. But recognizing that third-party security ratings vendors have been in market for longer than CyberGRX has been in existence and have established a place in the market. I'd love, Chris, for you maybe to share a little bit about your perspective on security ratings and how that fits into your world, where you're both representing Cisco to your customers and managing the third-party ecosystem on behalf of the company. Tell us a little bit more about that, would you?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And we've seen the rating systems really on both sides of the house. Because we have such a large global customer base, we get dozens of requests for these ratings that come in throughout the year. And so we see pretty much all the players in the space would send it to Cisco, because Cisco is considered a critical supplier of our customer base in most cases. So that's one way we've seen it. In terms of our suppliers, we have a pretty formal third-party risk management process in place with our ecosystem. And so we have used ratings a bit in the past. However, they've been more on the exploratory side versus, putting all of our eggs in one basket and use that as a sole source for risk identification.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's going to map very nicely to the experience of a lot of our viewers and listeners today, who are, we're all on a journey towards maturity in third-party risk management. And I think we all recognize that we've done things in the past, we're currently doing things, and there are things that we want to do into the future. So finding the place for security ratings that fits is going to be important for everyone to kind of give that consideration. But one of the questions that comes up to get into the meat of our discussion today is really around how much trust or confidence we can place in an outside-in scanning data source, which is essentially what we would understand security rating vendors to mean in this context. So I wanted to ask both of you, have you actually seen the security ratings assigned to your own company by these vendors? And if so, do you agree with their assessment? Obviously, one way of thinking about how valuable they are in your third-party ecosystem is to understand how they see you as a supplier to others, to your customers. So Norah, have you had an opportunity to discover how your company is assessed by these vendors today? And if so, what's your opinion about the quality of that assessment as it's presented to potentially your prospects and customers in the world?
Actually, because my industry is so new within financial services, so my company is a crypto asset manager. Some of the controls that are most critical to us from a security perspective are very different from your traditional asset managers. So I haven't actually spent any time looking at the information that's already out there, because so much so I've found when I'm looking at some of our third parties that are in the same space as us, that some of the frameworks just haven't caught up to be able to effectively capture the sort of control mapping that's for us. And so I think we're not there yet, but I do anticipate as this space grows, both in the US and abroad, that we're going to start to see some of those ratings get a little more accurate, at least for the controls that are, that are materially different. And I think the same is true for CyberGRX. And actually spent a little bit of time working with your team on how might we branch into our portion of the financial services market.
That's great to know. And in an emerging space like yours, obviously it takes time to for security to catch up in some sense, doesn't it? So it makes a lot of sense. But Chris, you're in a more mature segment. Security ratings vendors have probably had opinions about Cisco for many years now. What's your take on that? And I'm sure you have seen security ratings. What's your point of view on the sort of the integrity of that data as it represents you without your engagement or involvement typically? But it represents you to others. What's been your experience of that? Have you agreed with the assessments? And if you have disagreed, have you attempted to get them changed? What was your experience like in that?
Yeah, the experiences have been mixed, I guess you could say. In a lot of cases, and we've pretty much been engaged with most of the ratings companies just because of they're coming through our global customer base who have subscribed to those rating services. So we see quite a bit. And I would say that they're mixed. There's, again, a lot of these companies use sort of a public information sort of approach, right? Where they're taking public data, public IP address space, what's in the news, what vulnerabilities are out there, and they're using this to largely rate or rank some of these scores that happen. That's not, in our opinion, that's not telling the whole story, right? Because it's more of an outside to try to be in view versus an inside out view. Where we see a lot of the inaccuracies with these ratings is across 5 areas specifically. IP address space that's no longer affiliated with Cisco. Cisco has does dozens of mergers and acquisitions every year, it seems at this point. And we're constantly bringing in new IP address space or getting rid of old IP address space from old mergers and acquisitions. So those are ones that we're constantly seeing as an inaccuracy. We have external training virtual machines that are segmented from our internal network, but we use with people doing training. Those are wiped usually post-training. We get a lot of hits on those. We get a lot of hits on customer traffic that might traverse the Cisco network through one of our cloud services like Umbrella or our proxy services. So in those cases, inaccurate because they're looking at customer traffic coming through versus Cisco. Lab traffic that have been segmented from internal networks. And then last but not least, we do a fair amount of threat hunting that's out there. So we have honeypots deployed in a lot of places. And so we capture those. So, for us, I would say it's kind of been a mixed bag. Where we've used them from our supplier perspective is we use them, like I mentioned, more of as an exploratory, like if we're looking at a bunch of suppliers and we kind of want to do, hey, let's look at this and just see what's the public saying about this company. It gives us a little bit of an approach to that, and we can see, and then we can dig down more if we need to from a risk perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a use case that is very, very typical. And in the absence of alternatives, what do we do? With no actual data from the supplier themselves, one is required to think about other data sources. The question, of course, is how much reliance should you be placing on that? What type of decisions can you make at that early stage? Vendor onboarding being a classic use case. Well, it's time for an audience poll. I want to get everyone online to help us with this and answer. We got a couple of questions for you today, and then we'll look at those results together and we'll react a little bit to it. So as a similar question to the ones I just asked Norah and Chris, do you feel the security rating assigned to your company is an accurate reflection of the controls you have in place? It's a simple yes, no, or not sure. If you've not been able to assess or check into that, it will be good for us to know that. But if you have, just let's have your opinion on that. I did ask the question, Chris, while folks are responding, as to whether you'd had an opportunity to engage with those ratings vendors about your own ratings, given what you just said, 5 different areas where potentially misleading results might come up. Can you tell us a little bit, without naming names, what that experience was like if you've had that opportunity?
We have, and in some cases we've attempted to remediate some of the so-called findings that we've come across. And again, that's been mixed. Some of that has worked, and we were able to offload some of the inaccuracies, but some of it actually reappeared again as time went on, and things like algorithms reset or scans reset, and we ended up having a lot of sort of conversations that we had previously. And where that rears its head sometimes is with customers, because if a customer uses a rating service, they'll traditionally send us a report. That report could have dozens, if not hundreds of IP addresses, and they're looking for answers on why, right? And so when things have reset, even if they've been fixed in the past, it's kind of like an endless cycle of those conversations that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, clearly resource consumption that you would rather be spending on other things, no doubt. But it is difficult to manage cyber reputation out in the world, is it not? So let's take a look at our first set of results. We're going to ask a second question. So thank you everyone for responding. And what an even balance we've got here. It's almost a third, and a third, isn't it? But actually slightly more on the yes than the no's. But there's obviously mixed opinions to the point you were just making, Chris. Different people's situations will have resulted. And for those that did not know how they were reflected, it perhaps reflects the fact that there are a number of these companies out there. They don't engage typically with the companies that they rate, and so you might not even realize that your ratings are out in the world. But certainly worth a Google search or two, I would have thought, to at least establish a baseline from which to move forwards. So thank you for answering that question. Here's a follow-up question. How confident are you in the risk management decisions you make based on security ratings alone? Are you very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident? So the thinking behind this question was to say, let's explore a little bit, how big a decision can you make using security ratings? They clearly have a role to play. We just talked about that. In the absence of alternatives, they do provide data, and they certainly help in the initial discovery. I think we've already uncovered that in our discussion today. But where does that line get drawn? Would you approve onboarding a new vendor without an assessment, relying on security ratings alone? Maybe I can ask, while the audience is filling in the answers there, maybe I can ask that question. Norah, how far can you take it? Or would you be willing to take a decision based on, if that was the only data available to you, where would you draw the line for your organization, do you think?
I would say, it very much so depends on the nature of the vendor and how we intend to use them. And so when I'm onboarding a vendor now, there's a series of questions that I ask both of the vendor and of the person in the organization that's planning on bringing them in about, the nature of the relationship. What sort of data and connectivity is the vendor going to have? Where do I have potential risk with that new vendor? And if it's minor, if I'm not likely to have a realistic threat scenario that I need to worry about, then I may be willing to rely on ratings data alone. But realistically, if it's any kind of a material risk associated with a vendor, I'm going to use ratings as a starting point to try to figure out where do I need to go start my conversation with the vendor and focus it more. And so I use it primarily as sort of an early check and then a prioritization mechanism for going and having further and more in-depth control-based conversations with the vendor themselves. Or using something like the validation aspect of a CyberGRX to help me do some of that due diligence.
Great. So as part of a total solution, it's very useful in that early stage. But there's, depending on the inherent risk associated with that vendor and the application of that vendor in your organization, that will obviously make a determination as to how far you can go with it. That makes a ton of sense. Oh, look, we got some results coming up here. So that's an interesting, not as evenly balanced here. We've got a majority, it would seem, of our audience who today don't feel they can put a whole lot of weight on the reliability and accuracy, perhaps, of these security ratings, and perhaps for the very reasons that Chris was just outlining. It's not always aligned to the way that a vendor would represent themselves because of these other factors. But let me ask you this, Chris, any surprises in those results? Do you feel that makes sense from your point of view? Anything stand out to you?
So to answer your last question, yeah, I don't think we would use that as a sole risk identifier to our suppliers. For us, we look at a combination of things. So we'll look at things like industry standard certifications. Does the supplier have a SOC 2 or an ISO or C5 and ISMAP and IRAP, depending on what they're going to do. We look at what they have in terms of trust material. Do they have pen tests, letters of attestations? We can look at business continuity, disaster recovery proof, who their sub-processors are. We look at published industry questionnaires if they have them, like the SIG or the CAIQ from the Cloud Security Alliance. CyberGRX assessment is obviously an important part of that risk story for us. And then lastly, just based on risk tolerance, our most critical vendors, we have much more of a, I guess you could say, a dedicated connection point with them to form sort of that symbiotic relationship. And we're not going to do that across the board because we wouldn't have the time and resource to do that. But those are really for that, top tier, top criticality vendors that we have. And the risk ratings, again, it could be a piece of it, but again, we would use that more initially from an exploratory standpoint.
Have they ever got you into trouble, Chris, if I may be so bold as to ask that question? If maybe said differently, have you ever been burned by a decision that you made based on security ratings to this point?
We haven't been burned on one. What ends up getting us into trouble is Cisco. It depends on the risk rating company, but Cisco in a lot of cases won't score great on some of these rating services. Again, for the reasons I outlined below with the IP space, et cetera. And so what will happen is we'll get customers who use this as their sole sort of risk identifier, and we'll just get this massive report sent into my team and say, hey, you have an F in this column or a C in this column, blah, blah, and I need answers for all of these. And here's several hundred IP addresses that we need to figure out. And that's not an area that we really want to get into, right? Because that's really resource intensive. And the times where we have engaged, again, we find those usually one of those 5 items I talked about before. And so those are the conversations we're seeing coming up more and more with that.
Maybe, Norah, I can turn to you and ask about how you see what importance do you rely on risk assessments alongside of security ratings? Most companies use some combination of those two. And I wonder how you think about the balance, if there is such a thing, for your own organization. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about the application of other data sources beyond the security ratings and how you think about that portfolio or the balance across that mix.
Sure. So we do use a little bit of all of the above. So I tend to use security ratings, particularly unvalidated security ratings, sort of very early on in the process, as Chris mentioned, very exploratorily, help me guide where I might need to go focus my attention when I'm evaluating a third party. If I have access to a risk assessment, if it's provided by the third party, I am thinking about how much credence can I give this risk assessment? In the same way that you would with any answers to DDQ questions that are open-ended. If it's not been checked by an auditor in the way that like SOC 2 would be, or any one of their certifications, it gives me a sense of how they think about their controls. But generally, I use, again, those as a starting point to then go have a conversation if the risk associated with the vendor warrants sort of diving in deep and really going back and forth. Well, what did you mean about this? I noticed you didn't mention anything about this set of controls. How do you think about privileged access management or whatever it may be? I think those sorts, both security ratings and risk assessments, because they don't tend to be as fulsome, standardized, and fact checked. With the exception of some of the services that are trying to do some of that validation, you really can't get further from a confidence perspective than the beginning of the conversation. Later on in my process, I tend to rely on more of those validated tools, or to the degree that we actually put into our agreements with vendors requirements for certain controls, audits, checks, et cetera, in order to make sure that I sort of feel comfortable that we are getting the level of security that we've been led to believe that we're going to get from our third party. That's sort of the range and the timeline that I tend to use.
Do you use security rating vendors at the other end of the spectrum, i.e. in the monitoring space? Do you use them for ongoing risk management and not just for the onboarding use case that we've been focusing on in our discussions? Tell us more about that, Norah.
Yeah, we do, primarily because it's hard once you have a whole ecosystem of vendors to be able to stay on top of what's going on with them, particularly some of your smaller ones that may not, if they have a big hack or something, may not pop up in the news. We use it sort of both because we recheck most of our vendors at least annually. Some of the more critical vendors we're talking to quarterly. And so having sort of automated feeds coming from some of those services, in addition to doing true risk assessments on a couple of our key sort of strategic partners that we've got, helps us stay on top of what do we need to go focus on with them without sort of redoing the entire initial process, start to finish every year. So in the same way, helps us know where to focus, where to spend our additional cycles. And so I've got those feeds coming in the same way that I've got, threat feeds coming from several other places.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. And Chris, from your point of view, as you think about security ratings and the role that they play, what other data sources do you rely on to manage your third-party ecosystem effectively today?
Yeah, it's the one that I kind of talked about before, right? It's a combination of items. And so we want to see their industry standard certs if they've gone and gotten those. Like I mentioned, the SOC 2, the ISOs, there's a bunch. Any trust material evidence, I'm really interested on who their sub-processors are, especially if it's a cloud offering that we use. Business continuity, disaster recovery, those are important. If they have a CyberGRX assessment, we'll push them through that process. So it's getting them onboarded into our third-party risk process. And that helps us develop deeper relationships with them. Traditionally, we don't use the ratings in terms of an annual cycle. Those are normally used in terms of the onboarding process.
Gotcha. That makes a ton of sense. Have either of you experimented with the predictive data that is now available on the CyberGRX exchange. And just to explain that for folks who might not be familiar with that concept, essentially because CyberGRX has collected so many of these risk assessments, over 12,000 vendors now in our system, answering up to 1,100 risk questions as part of that questionnaire. We've been able to use that to feed a machine learning model, which can predict with accuracy now exceeding 90% how any given third party would answer those same questions, and therefore essentially populate a risk questionnaire on behalf of that vendor, not by virtue of doing an outside-in scan. We have a partnership with Risk Recon that provides that scanning capability, that ratings capability, if you will, but by virtue of the fact that we're using the assessment data, which is in standardized formats, to create that new data set, which is another way of triangulating, as we've been discussing. We don't want to rely on one source of data alone. A risk assessment in isolation is inadequate. A security rating service only goes so far. It's helpful for us to be able to bring other data sources in an integrated solution to be able to provide the best opportunity to make decisions confidently. That is a relatively novel concept. The idea of predictive data, as far as we know, does not really exist out in the world today, except through this means, because it's reliant on this high volume of high integrity data from which to do it. Are either you considering the use of predictive risk profiles, as we refer to them, in your business? Do you see a role for that? And how are you thinking about that as you think ahead to, well, what are the other things that I would want to see happen to allow me to manage my whole ecosystem effectively? Maybe Norah, I'll turn to you first for a quick thought on that.
Yeah, we do use them a bit, and in two ways right now. So one is very much on the exploratory side. When I'm thinking about a new outside relationship, we haven't landed on a particular vendor that we want to use. I've gone out and looked at several of the folks that we are thinking about at their predictive scores and thought, okay, are they in an industry where I think there's enough data that this is likely to be reliable? And it gives me a bit of a sense of, okay, when we're going and having these conversations, what sorts of questions might I ask to be able to differentiate between the different players from a risk control perspective? So we've used it in that way. And then the other way that I've used it is when somebody is not giving me the information, and a vendor is not giving me the information that I need to be able to effectively assess them. I've said, okay, well, listen, the bit of information that I do have is this predictive score that's out here, and it would indicate that you tend to be pretty good at this stuff and you tend to not be pretty good at this stuff. And, do you want to respond to that with your own evidence, and, correct the record if necessary, or on the parts where you're good, show me that that's true. And that has been particularly effective, because it gives them something now. All right, well, they're not starting from nothing. They're starting from a particular opinion that they have the right to either, validate or not. And we have actually found some success in getting folks to engage with us who I think otherwise were not interested in providing the sort of evidence that I needed to be able to get comfortable.
Yeah, those are great use cases. I appreciate you sharing that, Norah. That's really great to understand. Chris, have you been thinking about predictive data and how that can help your business in any way?
We have, and it's something we're actively looking at, and through your partnership as well. It's an important distinction there, right? Because it's not just, as you mentioned, the outside in view or just the public view, because the fact that a lot of these companies have gone through the assessment process with CyberGRX and provided answers to a series of questions and met with auditors, et cetera, there's a linkage there. And so, overall, I would say I would probably have more confidence in that data than just a blind, outside in type of perspective. So it's something we're definitely interested in pursuing and looking at further.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for the conversation today. I will have one last question for both of you before we sign off and let our audience get back to their day. The question would be, if there was one takeaway from today's discussion that you think you would like to land with people out in the world who are on our webinar today, what would be that takeaway for you? What would be your word of wisdom, if you will, based on your own thoughts about security ratings and how that works, that you'd love the audience to leave with today? Norah, what comes to mind for you?
Sure. So for me, it's take the time ahead of bringing in the ratings to think about what you really care about with respect to your business. What are the key controls and aspects that are important when you're thinking about third-party relationships, and use that and build it into the process so that when you bring in the rating data, you can use it to effectively prioritize your next steps when you look at some of the more declarative evidence that you may need to get comfortable with a relationship. I think if you try to just look at everything and you can't sort what matters and what doesn't matter, it's really easy to drown in the rating systems. And it's also really easy to be very checkboxy about it and say, I ran the report, so I'm good. And realistically haven't actually mitigated any risk. And so I think it makes it a much more manageable thing if you go do that work ahead of time, to make the rating systems useful to you.
Great advice. Thank you, Norah. Chris, what's your big takeaway from today?
I mean, if I would leave you with one word, it's balance, right? With third-party risk management, it needs to be a balance across multiple sources of data, multiple sources of identifying risk. And so I wouldn't rely on one single thing only. I need to be able to look at a handful of things that put together can give me that idea of what risk levels are out there. And so, I come back to it, looking at industry standard certs, having a relationship with your partners in your ecosystem, understanding and passing best practices along, looking at what they have in terms of artifacts, evidence, et cetera, and putting all that together to tell your risk story.
Excellent. Yeah, what a great takeaway. Thank you so much. Norah, Chris, thank you for joining us today. And audience, thank you for being with us as well. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to explore more, CyberGRX is an exchange with now over 12,000 members sharing cyber risk information and using all these data sources we've been talking about in an integrated way to help build and mature their third-party risk management programs. So please come to cybergrx.com, find out more, or request a demo. We'd love to help you out. Thank you for today. We look forward to joining you on a future webcast very soon. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.